Let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. Remember, we're streaming live, and for people at home or at work or wherever they're watching, so that they can hear, please use the microphone when you come up. Good to see everybody. I'd like to start with the introduction of the commissioners.
Robert Wilson, Pittsburgh.
Roger Marshall from the Great Bend of the Arkansas River.
I'm Gerald Lauber. I'm from Topeka.
Tom Dill, Salina.
Don Budd, Kansas City.
Admin support.
Keith Sexton, Assistant Secretary in Pratt.
Robin Jennison, Topeka.
Chris Jamison, Legal Counsel.
Todd Workman, Topeka.
Linda Craighead, Assistant Secretary of Parks and Tourism.
Okay, we're a couple of commissioners short. So Deborah and Randy are both gone today. So what does that give us? 5. At least we won't have a tie vote. Any additions or deletions to agenda items?
The only item I have is Linda Landerman will present workshop item number 3 in place of Rick Martin.
Okay. We need to approve the minutes.
Make a motion to approve, Mr.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay, now it is time for the general public comment on non-agenda items. If people have questions of us and questions and comments about things that aren't on the agenda, if you'd come up, introduce yourself, come up to the microphone. Sir?
Guess you're looking at me. I came and spoke with you guys, the commission, in January, and you had given me a tasking to work with the other folks in Emporia, Jason Geckler and his team. I did that. I wanted to come back and tell you where we're at and so forth. But before I start, I looked at the brochures that are around easels here, and it appears that Kansas is doing the right thing to figure out how to get tourism here and keep a lot of dollars flowing to us. But one of the things I didn't notice was the disclaimer on the bottom that says, this may sound a little rough, but I got an example here. It says, please wear protective gear when you're using the waters of Kansas. Put your gloves on and your shoes on so you don't cut yourself from the zebra mussels. So what I handed you there was a rope with a knot in it that was laying in the water for about a year, and that's what the zebra mussels decided to do. Now, obviously they're dead, but pretty sharp things that will hurt the animals and or people that are using our waters, and you probably know that already, but sometimes an example tries to bring it back around that says, hey, this is some pretty serious stuff. So just to follow up to where we were, before I do that though, I do have a kind of an open-ended question here, and that's why are bluegill and green sunfish singled out as the only fish that can be transported from one body of water to another? Now, I'm not looking for an answer today. Today I'm just wondering why. So the topic I have is zebra mussel contamination proliferation resulting from the state of Kansas fishing regulation change that I spoke of last time in 2013, which reads, you must use wild-caught bait fish only on the body of water where taken. Makes sense. Except for the change that says, except that bluegill and green sunfish collected from non-designated aquatic nuisance waters may be possessed or used as live bait anywhere in the state. So the issue that's unresolved is the contaminated water being transported to another body of water. So in January 2013, the commission asked that I work with the state zebra mussel focals, Doug. Both Doug and Jessica advised nothing could be done by them. Regulation will not be changed. Issue is with water being moved, and that is the Kansas Department of Agriculture's issue. I'd like to make two statements. Transporting wild-caught bait fish equals water from that same location moving with the fish. The water could likely have zebra mussel microscopic eggs, which, by the way, is why the fishing regulation requires live wells to be drained so that same water is not transporting contamination via the boat's live wells, and that contamination again being zebra mussels or other aquatic nuisance species. So again, I wonder why bluegill and green sunfish are singled out as the only fish that cannot be transported from one body of water to another. Not looking for the answer today, just wondering why. My second statement, the posting of a water body as contaminated does not occur until after the contamination has happened. Meanwhile, people are moving this contaminated water with the wild-caught bait fish to another body of Kansas waters before the posting occurred, resulting in yet another body of Kansas water being contaminated with zebra mussels or aquatic nuisance species. So the question is, why was the 2012 fishing regulation changed in 2013 to allow bluegill and green sunfish to be transported from one body of water to another? In January, I asked for the public transcript. Haven't been able to get it yet, but I think that Sheila might be able to help me. I don't know where that decision was made. So I would encourage the commission to go back to the 2012 fishing regulation. Not allowed to transport fish from one body of water to another, which is the same as our surrounding states. And this would immediately eliminate the increased pending contamination of additional Kansas waters and preclude the Kansas Department of Agriculture's involvement in addressing Kansas water being transported from one body of water to another. As requested during the January meeting with the Commission, I request that you reverse the position which currently will cause contamination proliferation. By reversing the position, your Commission will have helped prevent additional Kansas waters from being contaminated with zebra mussels. I appeal to you, don't allow any type fish to be transported from one body of water to another, as is now allowed with the bluegills and sunfish. Thank you for your time and your consideration of my request for your help in preventing future contamination of Kansas waters. Now, I happened to pick up one of the brochures that was over here, and it's interesting that it says the main way invasive species get into lakes and rivers and wetlands is by hitchhiking. If you leave a body of water without taking precautions, recommend this brochure is used and will help preclude harmful species being transported from one lake, river, or wetland to another. The aquatic hitchhikers can spread in many ways to include recreational equipment and in the water. It goes on to say, drain the water from your boat, live wells, and bait containers. Many types of invasive species are very small. Example, zebra mussels larvae are invisible to the naked eye. It also goes on to say, spray and rinse or dry will kill the species that were not visible when leaving the water body before transporting to another water. And then it goes on to say additional steps that are recommended: drain the water from your bait containers. And that's from the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks and Tourism. So thank you for your time.
Okay. Are there any other comments, public comments? Yes, sir. Go ahead,
Thank you. I just have a couple of quick questions. The hunting in Kansas is a major tourist attraction, major form of revenue for the state of Kansas. Privately owned land needs to be protected more than what it is now. My question is, what rights do landowners have concerning the wildlife while it's on privately owned land? The reason I ask this, the new state record deer that was poached in 2011 was poached on our land. I have tried since 2009 to get Wildlife and Parks to come out and set up decoys. I've never received a phone call back. I called reporting illegal activity, spotlighting at night. To this day, I have never received a phone call back. I got a salvage tag for this set of antlers. This set of antlers was found between 100 and 150 yards from where the state record deer, 14 point, was poached. As a landowner, the man admitted where he shot the animal. I would like to have possession of those antlers. I know the law states wildlife does not belong to the landowner. I would like a practical interpretation of that law. I know that animals roam. To my knowledge, not a single person in this room has permission to hunt on our land. While it's on our land, should it not belong in some ways to the landowner, to all landowners within the state? I cannot set up a high fence to block these animals in, I understand that. But while it's on private property, the landowner should have more legality, more protection than what they have today. Thank you.
Who's your name?
Tim Netto.
Tim, who did you call?
I called Officer Scott Lehman.
Is he your local?
He
guy?
used to be in Osage and Franklin County. He's now in Columbus, Kansas, to my knowledge.
If you'll talk to this guy here in the front row sometime during maybe the break, he'll probably be able to answer a lot of your questions.
Okay, thank
Okay.
you.
Hang on. Mike Pierce, Wichita Eagle. I've got a question. When he was sentenced for poaching the deer, which he did on your land, the judge awarded you, was it $8,000?
Yes, sir.
Did you receive that?
I received the first payment last week, but it was
Okay.
not for the deer. Our land is posted that it is hunting by written lease, $4,000 per person per day. The judge made him pay 2 days of hunting, not for the deer, for the illegal hunting on our land.
Have you ever been paid that much by anybody else to hunt on your property?
We put the price so high that we don't want people hunting on our property. The
Okay.
reason is this is a deterrent for people that want to poach.
Did you do that before or after the deer was poached?
I have had these signs up for probably 5 years.
Really? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Robert Williams, Topeka, Kansas. I have several issues here to touch on the last gentleman's comments. I would like to speak on the poaching and illegal activity. I would like to see, and if they may or may not be already available, the year-end statistics on citations, fines, and things of that nature made available to the public so that we can see and understand the scope and what's being done to prevent this. We've started a philosophy of commercialization and for-profit hunting in this state, and we really need to get a handle on this issue. The last big event here in Topeka featured that individual in their brochure and on their website, the very guy who poached that deer, front and center on their group photo. If we're going down this path of for-profit commercialization of our wildlife, We need to get a handle on that. And I have contacted the Wildlife and Parks with a request to implement a reserve officer program. And I've been met with more than a few different excuses why that wouldn't occur. Safety, financial. There are a number of sheriff's departments and municipalities that have those implemented within their departments, and they work well. If finances are an issue, we could add a fee to non-state or people coming in to their license to support that. In addition to that, fishing and hunting guides and outfitters, to my knowledge, have no regulation, no fees attached to them. And that, in addition to being a financial burden to our state, is a safety issue. Anybody and their brother can set up an outfitting or a fishing guide service without any oversight into their activities, to my knowledge. I could be wrong on that. On the coast, the minimum license would be a six-pack, what they call a six-pack license, which enables you to take 6 passengers out on a boat to fish or scuba dive or what have you. We have, apparently inland waters aren't required for that for some reason. The safety issues are still there regarding that. So I ask that you guys again consider maybe implementing those ideas. And the crossbow, am I able to speak on that? Is that the agenda? I'm not going to be here this evening. I'm a Kansas bow hunter. The crossbow intrusion into the bow hunting season, I take exception to. One of the spirits of the bow season is not having a locking device on your weapon. The crossbow has that. In addition to an unfair advantage to the crossbow hunter, it is also a safety issue. You are not, during the archery season, required, unless you're in the Unit 19 hunting or during the firearm season, required to hunt with Blaze Orange or Hunter Orange. That is because of the time it takes and drawing back and the stealth needed to be a successful bow hunter. I understand that the crossbow doesn't have as far a range as a rifle, but when you have a trigger mechanism with a locking device, all it takes is a pull of the trigger and you release your arrow. And that, again, is a safety issue. They're not required. Now, I am not opposed to people with disabilities or children, even for that matter, or the elderly being able to utilize crossbows, but anybody using them, I'm definitely opposed. We used to have, from my recollection, a minimum pound draw also on your archery equipment to be able to harvest a deer ethically. That seems to have been removed over the years. That also poses safety issues and ethical hunting conflicts, in my opinion. The debate, it puts all the burden of the ethics on the shoulders of who's out there hunting. And I would like to see more of an oversight from the state and some direction on what would be considered ethical, because as my son transitions into a bow, I'd like to know what the safe poundage, and not just rely on my own, observation, as to what might be the most ethical draw weight, for that bow. We eliminated that for some reason. Let's see. Pardon. I think I've covered most of what I had to say right now, and I thank you for your time. And I'd like to ask also if there's been any stats on the Unit 19. We've got the Unit 19 for my understanding was the purpose of eliminating deer fatalities on the I-70 corridor and I believe I-35 corridor, which for some reason it extends and encompasses all that Clinton wildlife area, which is way beyond I-70. I would ask that, has there been any studies made on its effectiveness, and are there any restrictions? Because if you drive just east of Lawrence on I-70 and look down to the valley, there's feeders within 100 yards of I-70. So if the I-70 corridor, if the purpose of Unit 19 is to minimize deer traffic accidents, and there's no restrictions on how we hunt those areas, we could be posing a greater problem by drawing animals to that area with feeders and the like. So I ask that you consider my thoughts and ideas, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Is there any other guests who would like to have a public comment? The first gentleman asked for an answer, and I think the formal answer will have to come from somebody in the agency regarding bluegill and green sunfish. But bluegill and green sunfish are identified separately because they probably are the most commonly used trotline bait in the state of Kansas. And particularly those people who seine and utilize their own bait, most of which probably come out of farm ponds, to which unfortunately the department has no ability to regulate the movement of private waters. And there's a big definition of what private waters are, but generally what we consider a farm pond is probably private waters. And so we're asking law enforcement to try to minimize the movement of water. Remember that if anything has been identified as waters that have been contaminated, it's illegal to move anything from there anyway. And it's very difficult for law enforcement to determine whether these bluegill came from a public water or a non-public water. And at the time, it seemed like probably somewhat of an intrusion. I understand and appreciate the need for minimizing water movement, but if the area has invasive species, it's already impermissible to remove it. And I think they chose those two species because they are the common species of wild caught bait that are used. As far as the other comments, I appreciate that. I don't know if I have an answer to everything. I do have one thought, that you stated that the burden of ethics is on the shoulders of the person in the field, and to some extent that's what we have to depend on. Kevin has 60 law enforcement personnel scattered in 105 counties, and without voluntary compliance and ethics on the shoulders of who's ever out there, we would have, there just isn't any other way to do it. I also think it's interesting about the feeders close to the highway. It does seem to be counterproductive. I guess I drive that way, I just had never noticed it. So I think that's something to think about. Any other commissioners have any thoughts or comments?
The most glaring one to me is, and Chris, you're going to have to help me with this probably a little bit, is the outfitter side of this, because I don't know if it's only me or if the other commissioners get it, but whenever I go across the state of Kansas, the outfitters is a big issue. They're collecting $1, which there's nothing wrong with collecting $1 for a service that they are providing. And we've had the legislature weigh in on this during, and go ahead and tell me how that is before I go any further.
Sure. The history of regulation of guides in the state in like the early 90s, 91, 92, we started regulating guides. I think there were 33 at the time. When I came to the department in 2000, we changed the statutes and ramped it up a little bit in enforcement. And I worked with Kevin. We developed some regs, strengthened some regs. We worked with an outfitting group. Shortly thereafter, after that bill was passed and those regs were passed, a couple years later, the legislature came back and parsed out a section of the guides. And then, we also had some complaints about consumer protection, which seemed to be one of the gentleman's issues, which we did not provide. That's the Attorney General's office provides consumer protection. So if somebody gets a bad hunt or they have a contractual dispute with the outfitter who promised certain things and they didn't get it, well, we couldn't help people there. And from that point on, since they had first parsed out a little bit, so we weren't regulating landowners, then they parsed out upland bird guides, and pretty soon we were left with big game and waterfowl is all we were allowed to regulate. And at that point, there was a bill introduced to do away with guiding and outfitting, and the department's testimony was you either need to regulate everybody, or you need to regulate nobody, or you need to self-regulate, set up a guide and outfitters board. And the legislature chose to regulate nobody, which is why we're in the position we are today. It's unfair to regulate a segment of a population and not everybody.
Right. So as we stand today, then, the department can do nothing, introduce nothing new, take no steps forward on any of these outfitters.
If you recall, last year we passed a regulation relating to use of public lands and registration requirements because there were concerns of overutilization of public lands by guides and outfitters. Given the fact that the legislature took away our authority, I think we're pretty much at where we're at.
I know where Don's coming from, and when I talk to constituents, almost without exception, there is a high level of disdain for outfitters. And I understand because due to the commercialization, there has been a big increase. I just don't know what we can really do about it because the agricultural interests are such that the intermediaries, the guides and outfitters who don't own the land, are seen by some as a means by which they're a conduit for commerce. And I just don't know how we can avoid it. However, they're extremely unpopular, and I'm asked constantly, why don't you guys do something about this leasing? Well, I don't know what we can do. I just don't know what to do, and I don't know whether or not while it may affect a lot of people, I don't know whether it's wrong either. I mean, it's a private property issue. So I just try to lend a sympathetic ear and can't really offer very much.
The odd part about this is when I talk to the people like myself and you people sitting in the audience who aren't outfitters for the most part, and we go out here and we harvest the resource and we buy a license and we go on, it's, believe it or not, we have the same opinion as the outfitters do, the legitimate outfitters. And I hate to use the word legitimate, but I'm going to, I guess, is they know there's a disdain out there from the public, and they wouldn't mind the regulation. They wouldn't mind a fee. They wouldn't mind a lot of these things just to self-regulate because they're seeing what this gentleman said, what a lot of you in the audience have told me, and what people across the state have said, that you're creating a profit off of a resource here in the state of Kansas, and we should compensate someone for that, and we don't want the one bad apple creating a black eye for us. So with that being said, I wish there was a way to resolve it, because I think that leads to many of the problems that we talk about at these meetings all the time in a roundabout way. I don't care if it's from the deer or the fish or the waterfowl or the upland. It always seems to get back to the same thing. It's about the dollar or an outfitter or something like that. And if maybe our council's smart enough to figure out a way.
Well, there was another bill that was introduced in the legislature about 3 or 4 years ago, can't remember exactly, which would have self-regulated, would have set up a guide and outfitter board. In my estimation, it was probably an economic protectionism bill for resident guides. So even amongst guides, there's outfitters, there's fighting, and who should be able to operate in the state and how they should be able to operate. So I'm not sure that there's going to be any resolution on the issue. I'm sure that if the legislature weighed in, or if it went in front of the legislature again, we'd probably end up in the same spot we're in.
I don't know how many of you played cutthroat pool, but you can envision 3 outfitters playing a game of pool on the same pool table. And I just don't think you're going to be able to get any agreement. All right, well, that's upbeat. Let's move on to the Secretary's remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excuse me. Had a pretty active couple of weeks as far as potential finances for the department. I think I reported, but I'll remind the department that when we put our budget together, the governor wanted us to take a reduction of the EDIF money that would go to parks and tourism, and a certain amount of that would also be used in administration to actually pay parks and tourism share of their administration. And we did take that cut, and we felt like that we could probably, the parks would be okay. We took most of it out of the parks, or we took it all out of the parks, actually. The thought being that last year, when the governor recommended and the legislature adopted our idea of paying off the cabin loan that Wildscape had, that would bring in around $800 to a little over $1 million annual revenue for the parks. And while we had hoped to use that to increase the size of the cabin program, with the governor's action, we thought that we would we'd have that as a backup if the park passport didn't work like we anticipated. And we'd anticipated, based on what happened in Michigan, which they had over 20% of the cars and light trucks get the park passport at the time of their vehicle registration. We conservatively said that we thought we'd get 10%. And when we constructed the park budget, it became very difficult for us to really project what our revenues were going to be, because we had the old annual park registration revenues, and then we were coming forward with this new program that actually reduced the park registration. It's going to be more convenient, and we didn't know how to get the proper mix there. So what we did was we just didn't even calculate that we would sell any traditional annual park registrations. And so we constructed the parks budget with what we conservatively estimated before the legislature last year, that we'd get 10% of those cars and light trucks to register. And it made it look like the park fee fund was going to do pretty good. In hindsight, I wish that we'd just left it flat and said we may or may not get more money. That's probably what we should have done, because I think that was part of the legislature's problem. I don't know that it was, but I think they looked at the increased park revenues and decided to take it out. We got along very well with the budget committee that had our budget. I explained all that to them, and they passed the budget just like the governor had recommended it. And then when it got to full appropriations committee, the first thing that they did was take out some of the transportation money that the department has been getting over the last few years. And actually what they said they were doing was taking out in about, Linda, 3 or 4 years ago when they started getting the park ops money, or that's what they thought they were taking out, was money that the legislature some years ago, when they didn't have any money in the general fund, they decided to take it from KDOT. That's, according to what they were saying, what they were trying to get at. And that was concerning to us because that was going to be a loss in revenue for us. The next thing that they did is they swept part of the cabin revenue fund, about $500,000, which that was very concerning because the point that we made to the legislature last year is that we were going to try to make the park self-sufficient. Well, if we're going to do that, we've got to be allowed to keep ending balances and actually build reserves so that if there is a bad weather year, we can get through the next year. And what they did was 180 degrees from what we had all talked about doing last year. I'm quite confident we're going to get that restored. I think they realize the error of their ways in taking the cabin revenue fund, so I think we're going to be okay as far as that goes. And actually, when you read the bill, what they actually took was not the KDOT money for park ops, but it was actually the KDOT money that would have gone into our roads. So that's not as serious an issue from annual operations as what it once was. I would give you a brief report connected to that with the park passport. The first month, which is not a good test, we only got about 2% of those registering to buy the park passport. The revenues are coming up. I believe Chris told me so far this month, the month of March, is 3,500. About 3,500 park passports have been sold at the when people get their tags. So it is getting better. Linda and the park folks are doing a lot to try to create awareness with the park passport. So I think that it will grow. I think that it will eventually be very successful and meet our target. I'm not sure it's going to do it this year. And if it doesn't, that we're going to have to be very careful within the parks division as it relates to that. But I think we're going to get most of the things worked out as far as the budget. And the park fee fund is running about, last month was not a good month compared to the year before. The year before was one of the best years that we'd ever had just because of the great winter that we had. So with the exception of last month, it's really pretty good, and wait to be seen what happens this month. But if the commission has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Anybody have any questions for Robin?
Thank you.
Okay, Chris.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, this is the first year of a two-year cycle for the legislature. We're past turnaround. Next week is the end of the second half, and the week after that, they will be working conference committees. So what turnaround usually means is that bills that aren't blessed or routed to an exempt committee or didn't come from an exempt committee are dead for the year. That doesn't mean they can't be routed to an exempt committee, because that typically happens if somebody really wants to make a bill move. So what I'm saying is generally we're close to the end. This is the first year in many years where it appears the House and the Senate are both passing a budget, and then they'll come back with, there's usually a supplemental appropriations bill, a mega bill, and then an omnibus bill. And it looks like the last probably 4 or 5 years, they've done all those in one. This year, they'll actually do all those separately. And they also said at the beginning of the session they were going to try to keep on a 80-day session track. They're allowed 90 days. They've gone over traditionally the last several years. There was one year, I think, that they ended at 84, but recently they've gone as high as 107 days. So I think this year they're fairly serious about keeping on track on that 80-day schedule. I'll go through, the bills that we have on the website are not necessarily just the bills that we follow. I track about 120 bills a session that impact the department in some way, but the bills that are on our website are the ones we feel are most pertinent to our constituents. Senate Bill 49 was a department initiative. It increases the amount of time on blood alcohol concentration tests from 2 to 3 hours. DUI law usually drives BUI law, and the changes in DUI law, and it drives boating under the influence law change. And so that time period for the testing went from 2 to 3 hours for DUI. We said BUI should have been included in that. The reviser agreed that they had accidentally left that out. We introduced a bill, and it's now about 3/4 of the way through the process. Started in the Senate, flew out of the Senate, had a hearing last week or the week before in the House Corrections and Juvenile Justice Committee, and then passed out late last week, and it's on House General Orders. So it has 2 more steps. House General Orders, the House has to adopt it as a whole, and then the next day it goes to final action, where there's an official vote. Senate Bill 50 would have required completion of a boater education course for everyone from a date certain in time. Currently, it's anybody born after 1989 and who's under 21 years of age has to have a boater education course to operate a boat themselves. And the department proposed phasing that in, just like hunter education and fur harvester education. The bill was introduced, had a hearing in the Senate, and hasn't gone anywhere since. And at this point, I don't see it moving the rest of the year. Senate Bill 57 was not a department initiative, but it's on our website. But it's the result of the department's discussions with the Department of Agriculture related to domesticated deer and high-fence deer, essentially cervids. And where it impacts our department is it allows the Department of Agriculture to request our assistance in enforcing the the domesticated cervid laws. And that actually started in the Senate and contained some provisions related to pets, which were ultimately stricken out because it was too controversial. It was kind of a larger bill with 3 subjects. Once they struck the pet stuff out, it passed out of the Senate rather easily, passed out of the House committee last week, and today popped up on House General Orders. So I think it's tomorrow is on House final action. Senate Bill 74, also not a department initiative, but it pertains to prison-made goods. And our cabin program, while we're not currently building cabins, many of those were built by the Department of Corrections. And the Prison-Made Goods Act prohibited prisoners from making manufactured or modular homes, which would have also stopped the cabins from being built in the Department of Corrections. I appeared in committee and requested an amendment if it moved forward, and it did, and amended out, essentially made an exemption for our cabin program. And that bill passed out of the Senate and had a hearing in the House, passed out of the House hearing, and just popped up on General Orders today. So there's a lot of movement on a lot of bills all of a sudden at once. Senate Bill 94 would define muzzleloaders the same as federal law. That was part of another bill, which was Senate Bill 21, and I think it's proved to be too controversial to be in that other bill. Went in as its own bill and has basically sat in committee since then. Senate Bill 223 is the crossbow bill, which seems to come every year now, and it would have allowed crossbows during the archery season by any hunter. It was scheduled for a hearing on the 15th, and the hearing was canceled. 1711, which is a House or a Senate resolution opposing the black-footed ferret programmatic safe harbor agreement. Basically, it had a hearing in the Senate, passed out of the Senate, was amended significantly on the floor of the Senate, and then passed the Senate as a whole, which is just a resolution that goes to whoever's listed on the bottom of the resolution, telling them that the Kansas Senate is opposed to the black-footed ferret programmatic safe harbor agreement. 2030 is a department initiative again, and it's deer hunting permits for injured combat veterans. That bill had a hearing in the House, started in the House, and it was our program. Basically, it would provide up to 10 permits for disabled veterans, combat disabled veterans to use who don't get in the draw, or we had several requests the last couple years for wounded warrior hunts that were at the last second when there were no deer permits available, and this is a way to try to accommodate that little request. Passed out of the House, no problem. Went to the Senate. On the Senate floor yesterday, they adopted it, and probably in about 15 minutes, I assume, the Senate's going to vote on it, and it'll pass out of the Senate, no problem. I didn't hear any consternation. So it'll be on its way to the governor because it was not amended in the Senate. House Bill 2052, discharge of a firearm in the city limits, and that has a provision in there that relates to the Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism, and city governments. And basically, the genesis of the bill prevents somebody from being charged with discharging a firearm unlawfully in defense of self or others, or a number of other items, and it's trying to standardize that law across the state. But there's a provision in there that says somebody couldn't be charged with discharging a firearm under a lawful program conducted by KDWPT and local government or nuisance animal damage control. That bill actually had a hearing this morning, and I went and testified, and it appears that the bill is going to become an omnibus firearms bill. It's not just going to pertain to discharge of a firearm in the city limits. It's tough to follow, and I'm not sure if I'm more or less confused after I went to the hearing as to which concealed carry portions of various bills are going to be put in there and survive. But it appears at this point that that's going to become the vehicle for concealed carry as well as other firearms law changes in the state. House Bill 2076 would have provided an exemption from licensing for disabled veterans. The department opposed that bill. It had a hearing early on in the session. It seems like that bill or that principle's come up several times over the last several years. And, while it sounds great in principle to give disabled veterans free licenses, somebody's paying for that, and we feel that if the benefit is provided for service to the state and the citizens, then the state and the citizens should pay for that. It does cost us lost federal aid, and it would also be borne on the backs of current hunters and anglers. And based upon those arguments, as well as the fact that that is provided for in the budget, we do actually give free or no cost to the veteran hunting and fishing licenses currently because it's appropriated money from the state general fund, or EDIF now. So that bill was held off. I don't think the issue is dead. The proponent of the bill continues to hit me every time I see him about that. Taxation of Watercraft, another department initiative. And what the department originally proposed was a reduction of property tax for vessels. Currently, vessels are taxed at the 30% level. We proposed in 2014 that would go to 20%, 2015 it would go to 10% valuation or assessed valuation, and then 0 in 2016. I testified at the hearing. It was very hostile. the committee, the House committee, there were people who didn't think that we should change it at all, and there were people who thought we should go to zero. Ultimately, it was sent to a subcommittee, which the subcommittee met Thursday and Tuesday at 8 a.m. each day and discussed the issues. The Department of Revenue came up with an alternative plan, but what I think is shaking out on the House side is a proposal that would reduce by a third, essentially, boat taxes for the next 2 years, and then it would go to 15% for the 2 years after that, and then it would phase down to 11.5% the 2 years after that, where it would remain. And, you know, essentially that would be about 2/3 of what people are paying now. I don't think that there was the will of the committee to go all the way down to zero, the subcommittee. And I tried to push for 5%, which I think those numbers would actually get closer to what Oklahoma has when you weigh out what they pay versus what we would overall be paying. The Department of Revenue plan that's floated, which may get some traction in the Senate, is more in line with a overall reduction like a motor vehicle, except the percentages are different, and it would be over a 20-year period. And whereas our plan gets to save about 60%, 66%, 65% of what they're paying now over 6 years, the current House plan, the Department of Revenue plan would probably result in an adjustment of about 75% in 1 year, just because of the age of many of the vessels in our fleet in the state of Kansas. There's a report today at 3:30, and Dan Heskett and Steve Adams from our office are going to attend on behalf of the department. It's just a report, and committees are jammed up, so I'm not sure there's going to be much question. House Bill 2362, amending the Threatened and Endangered Species Conservation Act in our state, had a hearing back in February. It would have made some major changes to our Threatened and Endangered Species law. The department has started the process for taking comments on or petitions on the current lists of threatened and endangered species. I think that closes in July, and then there's a 18-month process where the commission works and the task force works for those who have not done that before on the commission, and then they come back with recommendations to the secretary, which ultimately result in the regulatory recommendations. House Bill 2362 would have resulted in probably 60% of those species on the list, on the threatened list, being removed immediately, based upon the proponent's view that certain species shouldn't be listed in our state because they're a hindrance to development, essentially. So the bill did have a hearing. Robin testified on behalf of the department, and the bill has not gone anywhere, although I think that there's the potential for the bill to go somewhere next year, should there not be some sort of compromise this summer with the proponents as to some of the language. And with that, I'd stand for questions.
Will you explain Senate Resolution 1711 again?
Sure. And it's actually Keith's probably more, or Robin, more appropriate to discuss. I mean, a resolution is just a resolution. Legislators and legislatures send them out all the time, stating a position to Congress or to, they send a resolution to the Secretary of Agriculture, or in this case, it was the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture, Congress, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think, was included. But the resolution was in opposition to a proposed agreement that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was doing in relation to black-footed ferret reintroduction in our state. and it's somewhat of a complex issue, but Keith's been intimately involved with that process and is much more knowledgeable about the mechanics of the agreement, the safe harbor agreement, or actually the introduction, or if Robin has any comments. I don't know if that answers your question, or if you want to talk about ferrets, then I think you need to talk.
I don't know if we necessarily. I've been getting a copy of a few emails to which Robin has been bombarded and has answered them artfully, but a resolution is just that. This is what we think, and it's non-binding.
Right. That's correct.
I suspect Keith and Robin are probably ferreted out. And
Well,
so unless somebody else wants to talk about ferrets, I think I understand what this is.
Mr. Chairman, if you were kind of looking at the genesis of this, the safe harbor agreement is much more widespread than just Kansas. And it really is a new way that U.S. Fish and Wildlife would like to deal with ferret reintroduction. And in fact, WAFWA, of which we're a member, we are in a cooperative agreement, as is Farm Service, NRCS, as is NRCS. And the whole idea behind it is not a bad idea, in that it attempts to reward landowners to actually put in a place, or if they've got prairie dogs, for a reintroduction of ferrets. The problem with it is that ferret reintroduction in Kansas has been fairly controversial, and it has everybody stirred up. And so the legislature decided that they needed to weigh in on it, on the safe harbor agreement. And there are some things wrong with the safe harbor agreement. Even some of the folks that are very supportive of ferret reintroduction will admit that there are some components of it that just really aren't going to work. So I think there will be some changes to it. I do think it's ultimately probably going to come into effect, but it's just a little near and dear to some folks in Kansas, and that's why it's received the attention of the legislature.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, what I didn't point out was the comment period for that safe harbor agreement was open, which is why the legislature passed the resolution in order to get it into the comment period for the official U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service comment period. So,
Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments on these?
Chris, I had one question on 2362, the endangered species business. So did the department speak in favor of that or against it?
Opposed.
Opposed to it.
The department opposed it.
Can you just educate us just a little bit more why we're opposed to it?
Right. Okay. So it's somewhat complex, but obviously the department has authority to list species, and because of our endangered species law, we have the opportunity to do our own NEPA reviews on federal aid projects, which is National Environmental Policy Act. So because of that, sportsmen benefit, generally speaking, because that process is quicker. Otherwise, if the department's T&E laws are watered down to the point where they're ineffective, then we lose that ability, and then all review has to go to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for those federal aid projects. That's one issue with it. One of the factors that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service looks at when listing species is adequacy of regulatory mechanisms within states. So if we have inadequate regulatory mechanisms, that might push the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list a species where they might not otherwise list, which is a deterrent, or it's a bad thing for Kansans, a derogatory type of event in all. I think that probably the bill was a little short-sighted, and it pertains mostly to the genesis of it was fringe species that might be otherwise healthy in our state, but have a small range. I mean, healthy in another state, but have a small range in our state. That does not mean that that species is not important to Kansans or to the diversity of our state, and that we shouldn't manage those species in that way. And so the genesis of the bill was a couple of projects related to agricultural development. Once we resolved those issues, the proponents then brought this bill to try to change the law.
Did this have to do with an important snake?
It did. In fact, dealt with a snake in the Southwest.
Any other comments or questions?
Do you know how come they canceled the crossbow hearing?
One might surmise that wait and see what happens tonight, I think.
Do you feel that the lawmakers here, and I've probably asked you this question, I don't know if I've asked you publicly or not, but do you feel like the lawmakers are more involved or less involved in wildlife parks and tourism issues in the last 4 or 5 years?
I think that they've been involved pretty intimately since I started with the department. I don't know that it's any less by any means. I think that people, rather than coming to the commission to deal with issues that the department and the commission have regulatory authority over, tend to run to their legislator when they don't get an answer they like. I think that happens anywhere, but in particular, people go to their legislators and then try to get legislators to change the law.
And I think you've answered my next question. And if we're going to act on the crossbow issue, and I'm going to use it because it's what's in front of us now. We're going to act on the crossbow issue tonight. We're going to vote on it, and there's going to be a conclusion from the department. If one or many people don't like that conclusion, they can then
certainly
through the legislature do what they want to do and potentially overturn what we've just done.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
The problem with that, however, is that if we make a mistake, we can correct it. If the legislature makes a mistake, they don't necessarily want to come back and correct it. That's the reason I'm always hesitant for us to make a symbolic gesture of no, knowing that the legislature is going to override us anyway, and they may include it with some other stuff, and Chris and Robin can't get it stopped, and then we have a mistake that it's a little harder to take care of.
You know, statutory constraints, obviously we deal in regulations here, and the hierarchy of laws, the statutes control what we do. We flesh out within those statutes our authority. It's similar to the deer issue and the deer statute. You know, over time that statute was cobbled together and changed and eventually put us in a box, and that's what we try to avoid, is being put into a box that we can't get out of or adjust ourselves. So
I have to remind people that, and people get on me sometimes from the public, we're not elected. So we pass regulations, not statutes, and regulations by non-elected personnel have a long process to go through. And so we have, from the day we want to have something done, it takes a while. Elected officials can do something in 24 hours if you want. I'm mindful of the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, to which we dealt with, and it took a while to try to deal with big cats and stuff like this, and we got some bad press in an editorial in the Kansas City paper. Within 48 hours, we had a new law. And everybody, why didn't you guys? Well, we can't. We're not elected. We have to go through a longer, as it should be. And so that's why sometimes people go around us, but I don't like it. Any other comments?
And Mr. Chairman, I agree with you 100%, and I'm going to expand on it just for a second. The problem we have is when the lawmakers override us, put us in a box, which we're in, we can't get out of. Then the rank and file, the law enforcement guys, the guys and gals in parks, they're going to suffer the repercussions of whether it's a good decision or a bad decision. And just like the chairman said, when we do it, we've got a bait issue that we've been dealing with back and forth, and we're trying to find a middle ground to it. We've had a lot of issues, and not all the commissioners have agreed on, that staff hasn't agreed on, but we're trying to find middle grounds here. If we continue, and I'm not going to say to let, but to allow the lawmakers to make policy for wildlife parks and tourism, we're not only going to be in a box, we're not even going to own the box anymore.
Any other comments? Comments from the public? Hearing or seeing none, you have the next item.
Yes, Roger asked for this to be placed on the agenda, and it was just a short briefing on recreational access to Kansas waterways. There are two types of waters in Kansas, navigable and non-navigable waterways. That comes from a 1990 Supreme Court case, Meek v. Hayes. It actually occurred in Cherokee County, and in that court case, the Kansas Supreme Court defined the three navigable rivers in Kansas. And those would be the Kansas, the Missouri, or the Ark, and the Ark. So when in that analysis, they said, and the challenge was really to see if, I think it was Shoal Creek, it's been a long time since I've read that case, but Shoal Creek, whether or not people could traverse that just across the state line in Missouri. You can freely traverse all waterways as a member of the public. And somebody tried to do that and was cited, and I think this stemmed out of a criminal case. But essentially, as a result, the Supreme Court said, you know, the state of Kansas could have done what Missouri did and made it in their constitution that all waterways are navigable. They did not choose to do so. So judicially, we are coming back and saying what's navigable. And then out of that, there are a couple of attorney general's opinions, basically, and one's directly on point, I think, to your issue, which was complaints about four-wheelers. But it's not necessarily that. There have been complaints about hunters encroaching on other hunters on navigable waters. So we deal with it usually on an annual basis. But the public can freely traverse navigable waters from ordinary high water mark to ordinary high water mark. So everything else is non-navigable and does require the permission of the underlying landowner. And if there are any questions, that's just a short and simple breakdown of it.
Any questions for Chris?
I guess my follow-up question then, if people are truly upset about four-wheelers going up and down the dry riverbeds that were once navigable, that would probably be addressed through legislature again? I mean, obviously, if they pass legislature, then it might make it to the Supreme Court, maybe it doesn't.
Yeah,
but it's a legislative issue and not a wildlife and parks issue.
It's not a wildlife and parks issue per se. We don't own the riverbeds to the navigable rivers are not owned by the Department of Wildlife and Parks. They're owned by the Secretary of State's office. And so should the legislature try to legislatively define what's navigable and what's not, or, convert a public resource to private, I think there would be some constitutional issues associated with taking a public property for private use. But that's, the AG's opinions essentially
are the guidance that we have now, and those were requested by legislators on the issue. Okay, thanks.
Doug Phelps from Manhattan. Chris, I just have a quick question or clarification on private water, non-navigable waters. You have to have permission of the landowner. My understanding is you have to have permission of both. If you have landowners on each side of the river, you have to have permission of both. Is that correct, or?
Well, first off, Doug, I can't give you personal legal advice, as you well know, but
Well,
you have to have the permission of the underlying landowner, and
Okay,
where those
that's-
boundaries lie,
well,
you know, there's
well,
accretion and avulsion as rivers change course,
Yeah.
and you know, so I don't know.
Okay.
I know you have to have the permission of the underlying landowner.
Okay, well, that's, it's been floating around in the general lore that permission of one on one side, even if you stay on that side, isn't adequate. You have to, so that, you know.
Assuming that both of them own to the center of the river, which,
Yeah.
again,
Well,
I don't know the
anyway,
answer to.
well, this sounds like good news, what you told me.
Non-navigable.
Non-navigable rivers. Yeah. Thought he said no.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions for Chris? All right.
Thank you.
Let's move to the general discussion. We have an award that's going to be presented by our guest, Mike Stone.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, Secretary, thanks for the opportunity to have time on your agenda today. My name is Mike Stone, and I'm currently the President-elect of the Fisheries Administration section of the American Fisheries Society. And on behalf of the Fisheries Administration section, I'm pleased to present the 2012 Sport Fish Restoration Outstanding Project Award in the category of Sport Fishery Development and Management to the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. The department's Sport Fishery Access Program, titled Fishing Impoundments and Stream Habitat, and commonly known as FISH, was selected for this award from a field of strong contenders nationwide. FISH has been an ongoing program since 1998 that partners with private landowners to increase public access by leasing fishing rights. However, participation declined over time, as it does in many programs. FISH was revitalized recently in partnership with the department's walk-in hunting access program, using a combination of funds from sport fish restoration, fishing licenses, and the Farm Bill voluntary public access funds. Updated lease rates and incentives were developed for landowners. Terms for new leases were increased to a minimum of 5 years, and the program emphasized priority areas of the state that would most increase angling participation and use. An aggressive awareness program or campaign was conducted to reach the landowners, and these efforts resulted in an impressive 181% increase in fishing locations in 2012 over 2011. And there are many more details that I'm sure the fisheries and other personnel can provide for you. I'd like to take just a minute or two to provide some background on the American Fisheries Society and the Sport Fish Restoration Program before formally presenting the award to the department. The American Fisheries Society is the world's oldest and largest professional society dedicated to strengthening the fisheries profession, advancing fisheries science, and conserving fisheries resources. Founded in 1870, the American Fisheries Society currently has over 9,000 members worldwide, representing a wide array of fisheries interests. The mission of the American Fisheries Society is to improve the conservation and sustainability of fishery resources and aquatic ecosystems by advancing fisheries and aquatic science and promoting the development of fisheries professionals. The annual Sport Fish Restoration Outstanding Projects Awards given by the Fisheries Administration section are intended to both highlight the importance and effectiveness of the Sport Fish Restoration Program and recognize excellence in the categories of fisheries management, research, and education. The Sport Fish Restoration Program is commonly known as Dingell-Johnson or Wallop-Rowe after the primary congressional sponsors, obtains revenues through a federal tax collected on fishing tackle, boats, and motorboat fuel. The revenues are returned to the states to enhance fisheries and boating activities, and this is a true user pay, user benefit program. The program was first created in 1950 and expanded in 1984, and it has provided about $7 billion nationwide towards better fishing and boating. The Kansas Sport Fish Restoration allocation was about a little over $4.9 million in 2012. For the entire program period from 1950 to 2012, the Kansas allocations total a little over $106.3 million. The significance of the Sport Fish Restoration Program goes far beyond what is apparent from the allocations alone, however. The Sport Fish Restoration Program was the genesis of modern fisheries management for the states. For example, in my home state of Wyoming, the fisheries program consisted of a chief fish warden and a few fisheries hatchery personnel prior to 1950. Over the next 4 years, Wyoming Game and Fish hired its first fisheries biologists to staff a newly formed fisheries management program. Most were recent college graduates from the ranks of World War II veterans. This was the greatest increase to date in Wyoming's fisheries program, and it formed a foundation for modern fisheries management that continues today. In talking with the other states, including Kansas, they have similar experiences from that initial Sport Fish Restoration Act. More recently, the 1984 Wallop-Rowe Sport Fish Restoration expansion provided additional opportunity nationwide to broaden services provided for anglers and boaters. For Kansas, the Wallop-Rowe expansion resulted in great increases in hatchery improvements, better equipment, aquatic education, community fisheries assistance, and motorboat access. The Fisheries Administration section recognizes the critical importance of this program for state agencies, but also knows that the program is subject to periodic reauthorization by Congress and ongoing scrutiny from the users who pay and benefit from the tax. This annual awards program helps to identify and showcase those outstanding fisheries projects from across the country, and it is hoped to generate greater appreciation and continued support for the Sport Fish Restoration Program. I thank you for your time to provide this background, and this time I'd like to formally present a plaque to the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism in a recognition for the 2012 Sport Fish Restoration Project Award for their fish program. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, thank you very much.
Who from the department was responsible for this program that we should maybe recognize?
I think Fish Chief Tiger can help us out.
There we go.
This program was an effort in combination with our wildlife section. Jake George, who handles our WeHaul program, also helped secure the VPA grant along with Tom Lang. Tom's not with us anymore. He left to go down to Texas a few months ago. But really the work got done by my regional supervisors. Chuck, would you stand up? Chuck and Sean Lott and the regional supervisors and their staff worked hard to expand our fish program and to bring this award to the state of Kansas.
Great, congratulations.
All right. We're going to have some recognition for Rex.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. Back in 2002, Officer Jason Barker, who was a officer stationed in Wichita for the Law Enforcement Division, brought forward to me an initial plan to develop a canine corps within the Law Enforcement Division. And at that time, we assigned 5 officers to become trained along with their canine partners and to start this program as an effort to expand our law enforcement capabilities. The training initially was provided by the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, and upon graduation through that program, these teams came back to the state of Kansas and started their service to the people of the state. The foundation of this program is these canines were not aggression trained. They are trained for searching and tracking purposes. They search for articles, such things as firearms, spent shell casings, and wildlife that may be hidden or abandoned in the field. And at other times, they are used for tracking suspects, even fugitives who escaped jail, or in some cases, lost or disoriented people that may be suffering some type of mental condition. And overall, the Corps has served the state of Kansas very well during their use and service. Our canine partners also are a very important component of our outreach programs and education efforts. They bring a lot of attention to the department, to our programs, and make a lot of people aware of what our agency is about. After 10 years of service, one of our initial canines, Rex, is retiring, and we thought this would be an appropriate time to recognize Lieutenant Jason Sawyers and his canine partner Rex for their 10 years of service. Lieutenant Sawyers has taken on the role of coordinating the canine project. He has done an excellent job in overseeing the training and certification process and making the logistical arrangements to keep the project going forward. And we have intentions of maintaining the project for as far in the future as we can possibly see. So at this time, for his 10 years of dedicated service to the people of the state of Kansas and to our natural resources, I'd like to recognize Canine Officer Rex, along with his handler, Lieutenant Sawyers.
Okay. Thank you, Rex. Thank you, Kevin. Rex probably wishes that had been made out of rawhide so he could chew on it. All right, I'm going to make a little switch here. I'm going to ask the tourism review to wait just a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and have the roadside maintenance. While the agenda says Roger Wolf, Roger has informed me that he's just there for intense supervision, and really Scott Shields is the one who's going to be making the report.
Thanks, Roger. You're on that committee too now. Don't forget that. Back in 2007, our Secretary of Transportation, Deb Miller, convened a committee to look at our roadside vegetation management practices that we've had and over the years. And I work in the landscape. I manage the landscape unit at KDOT, and we oversee the seeding, mulching, erosion control devices on our bid items that contractors use to control erosion on our roadsides during construction. So I manage that department at KDOT. But back in 2007, the Secretary put together, organized a committee to look at our roadside vegetation practices and our management program. And there was wildlife and parks, there was organizations that are not-for-profit groups who are native plant societies, various other federal and state agencies that were involved in the committee. And we looked at our seeding practices, our mowing and maintenance practices, and the whole aspect of our roadsides. And on the table over here, there's an executive summary of the outcome of our committee and our recommendations provided to the Secretary of Transportation on some of the things that we wanted to change as far as our mowing practices, our new seeds plants that we want to plant on our construction projects, those kind of things. We've added, as far as our seed mixes are concerned, back in the 90s, 80s, and 90s, we planted almost exclusively smooth brome on our roadsides. And from 95 on to 2004 and into 2008, we have gone exclusively to native plants and forbs and wildflowers. So we have moved completely away from the tame grasses of fescues and smooth bromes and gone completely native in our rural areas of the state. Now in the urban areas, we still plant smooth or fescues in our urban areas that get mowed out on a regular basis because that matches the landscape. But in our rural areas where we have a lot of native grasses already, especially in the Flint Hills, we want to have tall grass prairie plants in our roadsides. And we've also increased the amount of forbs that we planted, or wildflowers, in that mix. We're planting about 40% of our seed mixes is wildflowers in our rural areas of the state. So that was kind of some of the recommendations that the committee kind of put together and gave to our secretary. We also changed our mowing policy a little bit. We have to mow out occasionally on our roadsides. If we don't, we'll have invasive woody plants take over, like eastern red cedar, sumacs, and some of those others. So we have to mow out occasionally to keep the woody plants out. And we can't burn so much because of the safety issues for burning our native plants. So we moved our mowing dates. We pushed them back to after October 1st, so that hopefully by then we'll have our first frost and those native plants that are growing can go to seed and propagate again. So we've done that, and we try to mow out, push back our mowing periods from once every 3 years to once every 4 years. And we kind of alternate the sides of the roads that we do that. So that's kind of the general outcome of that, from that committee, what we're doing. And I think it's been really successful. We've had a lot of positive comments from travelers who come through Kansas, who see our roadsides, they see the wildflowers blooming. I know the last couple of years, it's been really dry, hot. We haven't had a lot of blooms, but we will. That's going to change. So in the future, that's kind of what we're pushing for. We're looking, KDOT's looking for low maintenance plants. Native plants are low maintenance, don't require fertilization. They have a strong root system. They not conducive for erosion. You know, that's what we're looking for. We don't want to mow out as much as we used to because of the high cost of fuel. Now, those are the reasons that we're looking at to save money. It's a win-win situation, is the way we see it. So if you guys have got any questions, I've got some handouts if you want to see our seed mixes. If you want those, I can hand those out. You just let me know. Roger, anything else you want to add?
I personally would like to see one of your seed mixes, but I also have another question, and it's been discussed anecdotally before. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not you can use roadside landscaping and plants to have an effect on vehicle-deer collision?
You know, we have to have, the federal laws and require us to mow out certain areas for safety clear zone issues that we have to keep mowed. Sometimes our right-of-ways are very narrow. Like on the older highway systems, they're only maybe 50 feet wide. versus on our bigger 4-lane roads, they may be a couple 100 feet wide, okay, to the edge of the right of way. That makes a difference on if the deer, when they cross the road and they're coming from one area to another. And I really don't know how you could make any correlation between what we're planning and the deer population on the roadsides at all, because they're going to come through no matter what. They're going from point A to point B, especially during rut, and they're going to be there at certain times. And I don't know if the vegetation really plays a role in that or not.
Okay.
Scott, I got a couple questions. First of all, good job. I'm glad to hear that we're trying to make it more native and we're trying to make more wildflowers, and so keep doing that. First of all, educate me, which roads do you control? I mean, do you control every road in Kansas, or no, part of these are county responsibilities and they're the ones that's determining the mowing? Which roads are you in charge of? I hope it's all of them, but I'm afraid not.
Well, unfortunately, all we control are the state and federal highway systems.
Okay.
The county and the township roads are not under our control. So, that's the main thing.
Do you control the turnpike?
No. The turnpike has its own group of people who manage that at this time. That could change. Okay?
I get the picture.
So if I have constituents that are concerned about the county roads being mowed so short and it's a detriment to wildlife, that's really the county commissioners would control that?
Yes.
Why do you think they mow them so short nowadays compared to when I was growing up?
It's hard telling. It's people's preference. Some people like a clean mowed area versus other people who understand what native plants are all about and what the native environment is and the native landscape is. They want, it just kind of depends on what the preferences of the people who live there, what they want.
All county commissioners over the age of 60 have lost a radio antenna to a sunflower.
My name's Clay Adams. I'm the district engineer for KDOT for Northeast Kansas, and here at Roger and Scott's invite to specifically address the deer accident and whether or not our roadside mowing would have any impact on that. There have been some studies done on a national level in some other states. It's something that's really hard to do a control of. Here's a highway that has a lot of deer accidents, and here's what kind of roadside maintenance has been done, and then to change the roadside maintenance. Secretary Jennison and our Secretary of Transportation, Mike King, and I and my boss met here about a month ago to discuss roadside maintenance. And your secretary had an interest in looking at trying to do a study in Kansas. Is there a possibility that KDOT could set up some control sections, not mow them out for a number of years, and keep track of the deer vehicle accidents in that section? So we're gathering some information of some mapping out where deer accident vehicles have been happening on the state highway system, trying to find, maybe a location that have a lot of accidents. Just anecdotally, the thought in not the industry, but in a lot of wildlife people, when we mow our right-of-ways, we have fresh green grass growing on the highway. That attracts deer to be on the right-of-way to come and graze. And they're not protected by any tall vegetation or anything, so they feel exposed. So a car comes along, they're more likely to jump out or move. Whereas if we let the native grasses grow and there's sumac, they're not as likely to be in there to begin with for grazing purposes, but if they are in there, they're less likely to be spooked by a car or a noise. I drive about 20 miles of rural roads to work every day, and at least once a week I have deer running out in front of me, and it doesn't seem to make any difference if there's sunflowers or if the county has mowed the right-of-way or not. But we are, just for your information, our two secretaries are looking at the possibility of working together and doing a study, and right now we're gathering information.
And that's precisely what my interest is. I unscientifically have a feeling that less mowing might be better, but that certainly doesn't come from anything other than just an opinion. So appreciate.
About a month ago, I bought a new used truck, and I was driving to work, and I looked down to see if the temperature was up enough to turn the heat up, and I look up, and there's 2 deer standing in front of me in the road. So I'm very aware of where the deer are.
Anybody else have any questions for these gentlemen? Roger?
I would say, kind of in response to the question about county maintenance, my response to that constituent that asked would be to have them get the report that this committee put together and was provided to the Secretary of KDOT and take that back to their commission or their county commissioner and say this is what the state's adopting on the state and federal highway systems, and they're doing it for a number of aesthetics as far as and also for money saving options, and maybe they can use that avenue. I would strongly encourage, and we talked about that at length in the committee about how do we get that step down from the state level down to the county and levels and I think some of the counties are adopting some of those practices, but others aren't yet. So.
Would our department ever reach out to those counties and say, look, for the sake of wildlife in this whole state, you might consider letting your ditches grow a little bit taller and you don't have to mow them 7 times each summer, and we'll have more pheasants and more quail?
I don't know whether we've done that specifically or not, but probably wouldn't be a bad idea. Probably if it's done, it's probably done at the local level. One of our biologists is talking to a county commissioner or something.
Okay, thanks.
Pat Wakeman, Leavenworth County. I would like to commend the KDOT for getting a little more diversity on the roadside instead of making it look like a golf course. Question on haying. Who has the rights to hay, and do you control that? And just maybe one other comment on, I live in Leavenworth County, and they've been mowing the roadsides since January consistently, so we've got smooth roadsides. Thank you.
Well, Clay, do you want to answer? You might be better to answer that question than myself.
We do have a hay policy. We allow the adjacent landowners to apply for a permit to mow hay on the right-of-way adjacent to their property, and they have first rights up till March 31st. Then if a landowner hasn't applied for a permit and before March 31st, anybody else can come in and request a permit for that section. These new sections of highway that are being constructed and the new seed mixes are being used with all the wildflowers and the native grasses, we're not issuing permits for those sections of highway because it just doesn't make sense to go to the expense of planting those to wildflowers and then having them mowed down in June. So we do have some controls on that. We have some limits on the interstate system by district, but that's kind of what our mowing policy is.
Also, too, the areas where we planted, that were built in the 80s and then early 90s and maybe in the 70s, those were exclusively planted to smooth brome. Those are the areas that people want to hay. Those areas are not so much here in this part of the state, but maybe in central Kansas, maybe northwest Kansas, all right, some of those other areas, and they get hayed quite a bit because of the brome in the roadsides. Okay?
Ron?
Yeah, I'm Ron Klataski with Audubon of Kansas. And first, I wanted to do as you guys basically are doing, and that is compliment the Department of Transportation for the improvements that they've made in recent years, and specifically former Secretary Deb Miller, who took a strong interest in this and set up the committee, and Clay Adams was the chairman, did a marvelous job of tolerating a diversity of people on there, and Scott Shields, who's very interested in this. So we've come a long way, but I think we still have quite a long ways to go yet. And one of the problems that I think we have to address next is the invasion of Caucasian bluestem along the roadsides. And that's primarily where it's getting it started throughout the state. And it is going to be, in decades ahead, one of the great threats to native prairies that we have in this state. You can see some places already where it is completely taken over. There are no native plants left. There's just Caucasian bluestem. They're small at this point. It invades slowly, but there's only one way of killing and controlling that, and is totally eliminate the vegetation where it exists. So it's not going to be as easy to deal with when it gets out of hand as is Sericea lespedeza, which is very difficult in itself as well. The other thing, of course, is that most of the members of the committee suggested that the mowing be delayed not just to October the 1st, but until at least after November the 1st, when the native plants have gone to seed, both grasses and the forbs and stuff, and we have a better chance of enriching those roadside areas with these native flora. And what happens sometimes is when plants are at that stage and you mow them off, like Maximilian sunflower and stuff, it really hurts those plants and puts them in a great disadvantage in the following years. And for the standpoint of winter habitat and holding snow back, we'd actually like to see them delay the mow out on those areas until late winter, early spring, so that you'd have advantages to places where quail could sneak in and set along those areas, and juncos and hair sparrows and lots of other things that come here in winter. But we're not there yet, but we still have things to do. But department is very receptive to ideas, and that I think they treated the committee, as diverse as it was, very well. The other thing on haying is a bigger problem, and in particular out west, there's some areas where even the Interstate 70 is mowed from the east edge of Ellis County to the west edge of Ellis County every year. And it's more of a commercial operation than it is an adjacent landowner situation. And in years like this, where much of the CRP is being hayed and or grazed, and if the roadsides are made, hayed down as well, tell me where the next spring the pheasants are going to nest, and a lot of the meadowlarks and other things, and where are they going to hide in the winter? Where are they going to get a little bit of escape cover for roosting and things? We really, it's not the best cover in the world because it's next to a road, but it is some cover, and we need to try and maximize that as we get into more and more intensive agriculture in areas. And thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Anybody else have any questions or comments? Tim?
Tim Don, just with Quality Deer Management Association. Just two quick things for you. Some places you can get some information to if you're interested in learning more about the species that white-tailed deer desire. And one of those areas is the Noble Foundation out of Oklahoma. They've done a lot of extensive research on actually which species the deer desire over others. And also another individual to get that information from is Dr. Craig Harper out of University of Tennessee. They've also done extensive studies on what is preferred species for the white-tailed deer herd. So
you're talking about plant species?
As in forbs.
Forbs, okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Any more? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate everything that you're doing. At this point, I think we need to take about a 7-8 minute break, and then we'll come back.
I'm used to hearing a lot of people talking under their breath for the last several months, so.